The cold concrete of the garage floor was a stark reality against Alara's cheek. She heard the low thrum of a luxury engine idling nearby, a sound as smooth and predatory as the men who had thrown her here. Then a heavier silence fell, broken only by the squeak of expensive leather shoes approaching. The trunk lid lifted, flooding her eyes with a sterile, white light that silhouetted a tall, imposing figure. His face was a mask of shadows, but she could feel the weight of his gaze, an unnerving stillness that was more terrifying than the frantic violence of the other man. She met that unseen stare not with fear, but with a cold, defiant fury, her spirit refusing to break even as her body was held captive. This was not a plea for mercy. It was a declaration of war from a woman with nothing left to lose. But what happened in that silent garage would shatter two worlds, and if you watch until the end, you will understand how a single look can be more powerful than a bullet. Subscribe now and tell us in the comments what city you're watching from. Ilara Vance, 29, was an architect's assistant, a woman who spent her days drafting lines of impossible beauty for buildings she would never enter as anything but a ghost. Her life was a quiet composition of straight edges and muted colors, a careful blueprint designed to avoid attention. She moved through the opulent lobbies and sterile boardrooms of Manhattan's elite with a practiced invisibility, her presence as subtle as the scent of lemon polish on marble. Her dignity was a silent, internal fortress, built from the small, honest moments of her day. The perfect alignments of a drawing, the shared smile with the morning janitor, the solitary cup of tea she drank watching the city lights from her tiny apartment window. Her world was one of oppressive quiet, a constant, low-grade hum of anxiety that lived just beneath her skin. The pressure came from all sides, the condescending tone of her boss, a man who stole her ideas and presented them as his own, the endless stream of bills that consumed her meager salary, and the heavy weight of a family debt left behind her father, an honest man broken by a dishonest system. She was trapped, a lone figure in a cityscape of glass and steel, her dreams of designing buildings with soul slowly suffocating under the crushing reality of her circumstances. Her sense of justice was a dangerous spark in a world that rewarded compromise, a silent rebellion that played out in her refusal to cut corners, to lie for her superiors, or to surrender the one thing they couldn't take, her integrity. The sensory landscape of her life was a study in contrasts. She smelled the expensive cologne of clients who looked right through her, and the acrid scent of burnt coffee from the office machine. She heard the hushed, powerful whispers of deals being made in hallways she was meant to hurry through, the distant wail of sirens a constant reminder of the city's indifferent heart. At night, the oppressive silence of her small apartment was her only companion, a void she filled with the soft scratching of her pencil on drafting paper. This solitude was both a refuge and a prison, a space where she was safe from the world's judgment, but also profoundly alone. She felt like a spectator to her own life, watching from behind a pane of glass as others moved with a freedom and purpose she could only imagine. The oppression was never overt. It was 1,000 tiny cuts. It was the way her boss, Mr. Albright, would dismiss her input in a meeting with a patronizing smile, only to repeat her exact suggestion 5 minutes later to thunderous approval. It was the casual cruelty of the partners' wives, who would discuss their lavish European holidays in front of her while she calculated whether she could afford to fix her leaking faucet. These moments chipped away at her, reinforcing her powerlessness. Yet, they also fueled a deep-seated empathy for the unseen and unheard, the cleaning crews, the delivery drivers, the other ghosts who kept the city's gilded machine running. She saw the world not from the top down, but from the bottom up, and it gave her a clarity the powerful could never possess. This fierce moral compass was forged in loss. Years ago, her father, a brilliant craftsman, had been financially ruined by a handshake deal with a developer who disappeared overnight, leaving him with mountains of debt and a broken spirit. He taught her that a person's word was the only thing they truly owned, a lesson she carried like a sacred text. That memory was a constant aching presence, a reminder of what happens when good people are devoured by a corrupt world. It was the reason she fought so hard to remain unblemished, why she refused to bend to the casual corruption of her industry. She was determined not to end up like him, but she feared that her own quiet integrity was just another form of fragility, a beautiful thing waiting to be shattered. That evening, the air in the office had felt different, charged with a dangerous energy. A new client, a man with cold eyes and a smile that never reached them, had cornered her by the blueprints. He'd made a request, a small change to a zoning document, a tiny, illegal lie that would make him millions. She had refused, her voice quiet but firm. His smile had vanished, replaced by a look of chilling appraisal. He hadn't argued or threatened. He had simply nodded, a silent promise hanging in the air between them. As she packed her bag to leave, she felt his eyes on her back, a predatory stillness that followed her out of the building and into the descending darkness of the city streets, unaware that her quiet life was about to be irrevocably breached. The city swallowed her whole the moment she stepped onto the pavement. The streetlights bled into the damp evening air, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to claw at the edges of her vision. She pulled her thin coat tighter, a useless shield against the chilling wind and the oppressive sense of being watched that had clung to her since leaving the office. The walk to the subway was a familiar gauntlet of indifferent faces and hurried footsteps, a river of humanity in which she was just another anonymous drop. Her mind, however, was miles away, tracing the elegant, impossible curves of a cantilevered roof she had sketched in secret, a design born from a hope she barely dared to acknowledge. This nightly journey was a harsh reminder of the chasm between her dreams and her reality, a world she helped design but could never inhabit. Her apartment was a small, quiet box perched high above the chaos, a space defined by its limitations. Yet, she had imbued it with a fierce personal order. Her few books were neatly stacked, her drafting table was immaculate, and a single, resilient orchid sat on the windowsill, a stubborn splash of life against the cold glass. From here, she could see the glittering towers of Manhattan, monuments to the power and wealth that felt as distant as the stars. She had drawn the lines for some of those buildings, her hand shaping the penthouses of men who would never know her name. The view was both an inspiration and an insult, a nightly portrait of her own invisibility, reinforcing the silent, unbreachable walls that surrounded her existence. The shrill ring of her phone shattered the calm. It was her mother, her voice a familiar blend of love and anxiety, laced with the unspoken weight of financial strain. The conversation was a carefully choreographed dance around the subject of the mounting medical bills for her ailing aunt, the same debt that had tethered Alara to her soul-crushing job. She offered reassurances she didn't feel, promising that everything was under control, that her job was stable. Each word was a small betrayal of her own precarious situation. Hanging up, the silence that returned felt heavier, now filled with the ghosts of responsibility. She was the designated pillar for a family that saw her as strong, never realizing she was slowly eroding from the inside out under the immense pressure. Later, the glow of her laptop cast a sterile light on her face as she worked, not on the firm's projects, but on her own. This was her true life, but one lived in the quiet hours after midnight. An email notification flashed on the screen, a message from Mr. Albright. The text was cold, clinical, and laced with threat. It spoke of client satisfaction and team loyalty, thinly veiled criticisms of her refusal to comply with the illegal request. He reminded her that in their world, flexibility was a greater virtue than integrity. The message was a clear warning. She had stepped out of line and her defiance had been noted. Her small act of moral courage had placed a target on her back, making her not just invisible, but disposable. To escape the rising tide of anxiety, she turned to a small, worn wooden box on her bookshelf. Inside was a collection of her father's old drafting tools and a faded photograph of him at his workshop, his face alight with the pride of creation. He had been a man who built things with his hands, who believed in the honesty of wood and steel. He had taught her that a structure's strength came from its foundation, a lesson she had applied to her own character. Holding the cold metal of his compass, she felt a flicker of his spirit, a stubborn refusal to be broken. It was a fleeting moment of connection, a reminder of the legacy of dignity she was fighting so desperately to uphold in a world that seemed determined to grind it into dust. As the hours bled into one another, the solitude of her apartment began to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a cell. The city outside hummed with a life she wasn't part of, the distant laughter from a bar, the muffled bass of a passing car, the faint siren song of a world in constant motion. She was an island in a sea of 7 million souls, her silence a profound statement of her isolation. This loneliness was her greatest vulnerability. There was no one to call, no one to confide in about the veiled threat from her boss or the unnerving stillness of the client with the dead eyes. She was entirely on her own, a single, unwavering line in a blueprint that was about to be violently erased. The next day at the office, the air was thick with the tension she could taste. Colleagues who normally offered a polite morning greeting now avoided her gaze, their silence a form of judgment. Whispers followed her down the hallway, rumors about the influential new client she had apparently offended. The ticking of the large clock in the main workspace seemed to mock her. Each second a slow, deliberate measure of her impending fall from grace. She felt like a ghost haunting the halls of her own life, her presence already fading as the corporate machinery prepared to expel her. The world she had navigated with quiet dignity had become a hostile territory, and she was an unwelcome trespasser. The summons came just after lunch. Mr. Albright called her into his glass-walled office, the other employees watching like spectators at a public execution. He didn't raise his voice. His words were calm, precise, and utterly devastating. He spoke of her naivete and inability to grasp the nuances of business, effectively painting her integrity as a professional failing. As a punishment, he reassigned her from all design work, demoting her to the archives, a windowless room in the basement filled with forgotten projects. It was a calculated act of humiliation, designed to break her spirit and serve as a warning to others. She stood there, absorbing the blow without a word, her silence her only remaining armor. That evening, as she left the building, stripped of her purpose, the city felt different. The shadows were darker, the alleys more menacing. A block from her usual subway entrance, she saw it. A sleek black sedan parked in a no-stopping zone, its engine idling softly. It was the same car the dangerous client had used. A cold dread snaked up her spine. It couldn't be a coincidence. She ducked her head and quickened her pace, her heart hammering against her ribs. The feeling of being a target was no longer a paranoid fantasy. It was a palpable threat, a predator's gaze she could feel on the back of her neck, following her into the descending gloom of the city. She decided to take a different route, losing herself in the anonymous flow of the evening rush. But as she neared the entrance to a different subway station, a figure stepped out from a darkened doorway, blocking her path. It was the client's associate, the man with the brutish face and empty eyes. He wasn't aggressive, but his stillness was more terrifying than any overt threat. Behind him, another man appeared, cutting off her retreat. "Miss Vance," the first man said, his voice a low rumble that was almost polite. "Our employer was disappointed. He'd like a chance to change your mind." The world around her dissolved, the sounds of the city fading to a distant roar as she realized her quiet, ordered life had just come to an end. They shoved her from the car into a different kind of darkness, one that smelled of cold concrete, expensive leather, and old money. The air in the underground garage was still and sterile, the silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. It was a tomb of polished chrome and steel where luxury vehicles slept like metallic beasts in their designated coffins. Ilara lay on the floor, the rough texture of the ground imprinting on her cheek, listening to the hushed, fearful whispers of her captors. There was a shift in the atmosphere, a sudden drop in temperature that had nothing to do with the ventilation. The nervous energy of the two men curdled into pure, unadulterated fear. A presence had arrived, one that commanded silence without a single word. She felt it before she saw it, an aura of absolute, unshakable authority. The footsteps were not hurried or aggressive. They were measured, deliberate, the sound of handmade Italian leather shoes clicking on the polished floor with an unnerving rhythm. Each step was a pronouncement of control, echoing in the vast empty space. Ilara held her breath, her own frantic heartbeat a stark contrast to the calm, predatory advance of the approaching figure. The two men who had handled her so brutally now seemed to shrink, their physical bulk dissolving into nervous deference. They parted like water before a ship's bow, their eyes fixed on the ground. She understood then that whatever danger they represented, it was nothing compared to the quiet storm that was now moving directly toward her. This was not chaos. This was order, cold and absolute. He came to a stop a few feet away, a figure carved from shadow and discipline. Don Vincent Falcone was dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that seemed to absorb the low ambient light of the garage. He was not a large man, but his presence filled the space, commanding it. His face was a study in controlled stillness, his dark eyes missing nothing as they swept over the scene. There was no visible anger, no theatrical outrage. There was only a profound, chilling disappointment that was infinitely more terrifying. His gaze lingered on the two men for a beat, a silent interrogation that stripped them bare. Then his eyes fell upon the car, a sleek black sedan, and with a nearly imperceptible nod, he gave a silent command. The trunk lid was lifted with a hesitant click, revealing Ilara in the harsh glare of the interior light. She blinked against the sudden brightness, her bound form a stark violation in the pristine order of the garage. Falcone's expression did not change, but a muscle feathered in his jaw, the only sign of the fury simmering beneath the placid surface. He looked at her not as a person, but as a transgression, a piece of evidence in a crime committed against his own unwritten laws. His silence was an indictment, a heavy blanket that smothered all sound. To him, this was not just a kidnapping, it was a profound disrespect, a stain upon the carefully curated fabric of his empire, and it would be dealt with swiftly and without mercy. Without looking away from Ilara, he spoke to the man beside him, Richie Gallo. His voice was low, a gravelly whisper that carried more weight than a shout. "My rules are not suggestions, Richie." It was not a question or a threat. It was a statement of fact, a reminder of a covenant that had just been irrevocably broken. The temperature in the garage seemed to drop another 10 degrees. Richie, a man who inspired fear in others, visibly trembled, his face paling to a sickly white. He opened his mouth to offer an explanation, a pathetic excuse, but Falcone raised a single, perfectly manicured hand, and the words died in Richie's throat. The judgment had been passed. There would be no appeal. Then Falcone's gaze settled fully on Ilara. It was an intense, analytical stare that seemed to peel back the layers of her fear and exhaustion to see what lay beneath. He expected to find a broken spirit, the pleading terror he had seen in the eyes of countless others who had crossed his path. He was prepared for tears, for pleas, for the predictable collapse of a victim. He had built his world on understanding the mechanics of fear, on predicting the precise breaking point of any man or woman. But as he looked at her, he saw none of it. He saw something else entirely, something he hadn't encountered in years, something that unsettled the very foundations of his world. Ilara met his stare. Pinned by the sterile light, bound and helpless, she did the only thing she had left to do. She fought back with her eyes. She poured all her silent rage, her lifetime of quiet dignity, and her unyielding sense of justice into that single, defiant look. It was not a plea for help. It was an accusation. It was the look of a person who refused to be categorized as a casualty, who held on to her own moral clarity even in the face of utter degradation. In her gaze, there was no submission, only a cold, burning fury that seemed to ask him what kind of man presided over a world where this was allowed to happen. It was a challenge that struck him with the force of a physical blow. For the first time that night, Vincent Falcone was thrown off balance. This woman, with nothing but the fire in her eyes, had managed to do what rival families and federal agents had failed to do. She had breached his defenses. He saw in her a reflection of a code he preached but rarely witnessed, an unyielding honor that existed outside of power and violence. It was a mirror to a part of himself he thought long dead. Without another thought, he stepped forward, pulling a small, elegant pocket knife from his suit. He knelt, the expensive fabric of his trousers brushing against the grimy concrete, and with a steady, deliberate hand, he began to slice through the thick ropes binding her wrists. The proximity was suffocating. She could smell the faint, clean scent of his cologne, a mix of bergamot and something dark like cedar. She felt the warmth radiating from his body, a stark contrast to the cold fear that had encased her. As the last of the ropes fell away, his fingers brushed against her skin for a fleeting second. The touch was electric, a jolt of impossible connection in a moment of pure terror. He rose to his full height and, shrugging off his cashmere overcoat, draped it gently over her trembling shoulders. The heavy, soft wool enveloped her, a shield of impossible luxury and unspoken protection. It was an act of possession and of penance, a gesture that irrevocably linked them. He offered her a hand. After a moment's hesitation, she took it, his grip firm and steady as he helped her to her feet. He did not speak. He simply turned and began to walk toward a private elevator at the far end of the garage, his hand still holding hers, leading her away from the scene of her violation. He left Richie Gallo standing by the open trunk, a ghost awaiting his own execution. As the polished steel doors of the elevator slid shut, sealing them in a small, silent world of their own, Ilara knew her life had been fractured. The quiet, orderly existence she had known was gone forever, replaced by the lingering scent of cedar and the terrifying, magnetic pull of the man who had just saved her. The days that followed were a study in fractured reality. Ilara tried to stitch the fabric of her old life back together, but the threads refused to hold. The memory of the garage, the cold floor, the blinding light, the terrifying quiet of Vincent Falcone was a ghost that haunted her every waking moment. She returned to her small apartment, a space that once felt like a sanctuary, but now seemed fragile, its walls too thin to keep the world out. His cashmere overcoat lay draped over her only armchair, an object of impossible contradiction. It smelled of him, a subtle, clean scent of cedar and expensive wool, a fragrance that was both a reminder of her terror and the undeniable, shocking fact of her rescue. It was a piece of his world, an invader in hers, and she could neither bring herself to wear it nor discard it. She quit her job at the architectural firm the next morning via a cold, brief email. The thought of facing Mr. Albright, of returning to the place where her small act of defiance had triggered such a catastrophic response, was unbearable. Her world had shrunk to the four walls of her apartment. The city outside, once a landscape of distant dreams, now felt like a hunting ground. Every black sedan that passed on the street below sent a jolt of ice through her veins. She felt watched, a pawn in a game whose rules she would never understand. Her solitude, once a quiet comfort, had become a source of profound vulnerability. She was adrift, severed from her past and terrified of a future that was no longer her own to design. Several times, she bundled the heavy coat into a bag, determined to leave it in a charity bin, to erase the last physical trace of that night. Yet each time, her hands would still. The memory of its weight settling on her shoulders, a shield against the cold and the fear, was too powerful. It was a paradox she could not solve. The man who presided over the darkness was also the one who had led her out of it. The coat was a symbol of that terrifying duality, a tangible piece of evidence that the lines between good and evil, monster and savior, were far more blurred than she had ever imagined. It remained in her apartment, a silent, charcoal-colored testament to the night her world had irrevocably tilted on its axis. A week later, desperation for normalcy drove her to a small, quiet cafe in a neighborhood she rarely visited, hoping the anonymity would be a balm. She sat with a sketchbook, her pencil tracing the familiar, comforting lines of a building facade, trying to lose herself in the work. Then she felt it, a shift in the room's atmosphere, the same sudden, charged stillness she had felt in the garage. She looked up slowly, her heart beginning a low, heavy drum against her ribs. Across the room, seated in a secluded booth, was Vincent Falcone. He wasn't looking at her directly, but she knew he was aware of her every breath. He was simply there, a silent, imposing statue in a world of casual chatter and clinking porcelain. Her first instinct was pure, primal fear. She wanted to gather her things and flee, to disappear back into the city's anonymous crowds. But she was frozen, pinned by the intensity of his unseen gaze. He wasn't threatening her. His presence felt more like an assessment, a quiet observation. He was dressed in another impeccably tailored suit, a dark island of power and control in the sunlit cafe. She watched as the waitress approached his table, her usual cheerful demeanor replaced by a nervous, deferential tremor. He spoke to the woman with a quiet courtesy that was somehow more unnerving than a command, a gesture of control so absolute it required no effort. He was a king in a borrowed room, and his kingdom was built on the silent fear of others. He never once turned his head to meet her eyes. He simply drank his espresso, his movements economical and precise. The silence stretching between their two tables was a living thing, thick with unspoken questions and dangerous possibilities. Ilara found she could not look away. She was studying him, trying to reconcile the man who calmly read a newspaper with the cold-eyed predator from the garage. She saw the faint lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the disciplined set of his jaw. For a brief, insane moment, she saw not a monster, but a man encased in a profound loneliness, a solitude as deep and unbreachable as her own. Then, just as quietly as he had appeared, he placed a few bills on the table and was gone. The encounters continued, always with the same unnerving subtlety. She saw him once standing across the street from the grocery store, his silhouette a dark slash against the setting sun. Another time, his car was parked down the block from her apartment building for a few minutes before it silently pulled away. These were not coincidences. He was watching her, a silent, invisible guardian or a patient predator. She couldn't decide which was more terrifying. She felt like a specimen under a microscope, her small, broken life being examined by a force she couldn't comprehend. The fear remained, a constant, cold companion, but it was now threaded with a dangerous, burgeoning curiosity about the man himself. He finally broke the silence one rain-swept evening as she was fumbling with her keys at her apartment door. His voice came from the shadows of the hallway, low and calm, making her jump. "You should have the landlord fix that lock." Ilara spun around, her keys clattering to the floor. Vincent Falcone stood there, holding a small, plain cardboard box. He made no move to approach, maintaining a respectful distance. He was not the fearsome Don in that moment, but simply a man standing in a poorly lit hallway. "These were delivered to your old office," he said, his voice a low rumble. He gestured with the box, an offering.
She stared at him, her mind racing. How did he know about the lock? How did he get the package? The questions piled up, forming a wall of fear and mistrust. Yet his eyes held no menace. They were dark, unreadable, but they held a strange stillness, a quiet intensity that seemed to be searching for something in her own gaze. He was waiting for her to react, giving her the control she had so violently lost. Slowly, cautiously, she bent down to retrieve her keys, her movements stiff. When she rose, he had stepped forward and placed the box on the floor beside her. "Be safe, Ilara," he whispered, the sound of her name on his lips both an intimacy and a warning. Then he turned and walked away. Inside her apartment, she opened the box with trembling hands. It contained her father's old drafting tools and the small wooden box with his photograph, the personal effects she had kept in her desk drawer.
He had gone to the trouble of retrieving the most personal, most meaningful fragments of her former life. It was a gesture of profound, unsettling thoughtfulness. This man, who dealt in violence and fear, had taken the time to understand what she valued. The act was a quiet invasion of her history, yet it was also an act of incredible kindness. The contradiction left her breathless, her fear of him now warring with a growing, bewildering sense of connection. He began to create reasons for them to meet, always in public, always with a veneer of plausibility. He appeared at a small architectural exhibit she attended, claiming a sudden interest in modern design. He was a seamless chameleon, his usual intimidating aura softened into the guise of a wealthy patron. He guided her through the displays, his knowledge of structure and form surprisingly deep. He spoke of buildings as living things, with souls and histories, echoing the very sentiments her father had instilled in her. In his voice, she heard a flicker of a man he might have been, a man who appreciated beauty and permanence, a stark contrast to the destructive nature of his world. During that conversation, surrounded by models of glass and steel, their hands brushed as they both reached for a brochure. The contact was fleeting, a spark of warmth that shot up her arm, leaving a trail of fire in its wake. She pulled her hand back as if burned, her breath catching in her throat. He didn't acknowledge the touch, but she saw it in his eyes, a flicker of something deep and unguarded, a momentary crack in his impenetrable facade. The air between them came heavy, charged with a tension that was no longer just about fear. It was a fragile, dangerous awareness, a recognition of a pull that defied logic, morality, and self-preservation. He was drawn to her light, to the unwavering moral compass that had so startled him in the garage. She represented a world of integrity he had long ago abandoned. In her presence, the immense weight of his sins felt heavier, yet the possibility of absolution felt, for the first time, real. He found himself orchestrating these brief encounters just to watch her, to see the way her brow furrowed in concentration when she studied a blueprint, to hear the quiet conviction in her voice when she spoke of her work. She was a reminder of a path not taken, and he was both tormented and captivated by the reflection of the man he could never be. For Ilara, the fear was slowly being overshadowed by a perilous fascination. She saw the loneliness he tried to conceal, the guilt that flickered in his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. He was a man of immense power, yet he seemed trapped by it, a prisoner in a gilded cage of his own making. She began to see the man behind the myth, a complex, wounded individual whose capacity for gentleness was as profound as his capacity for violence. This discovery was terrifying, for it made him human, and it was far easier to hate a monster than it was to feel empathy for a man who could order a death as easily as he could retrieve a box of cherished memories. Their worlds were colliding with increasing force. One evening, he took her to a quiet, obscenely expensive restaurant, insisting they needed to talk. The entire establishment deferred to him. Whispers followed in their wake. She felt the eyes of everyone on her, judging, speculating. This was his power made manifest, and it suffocated her. He wanted to explain, to warn her that the man she had defied at her old firm was more dangerous than she knew, and that her active integrity had put her in the crosshairs of a rival organization. He was offering protection, but she knew it came at a price. Accepting his help meant stepping fully into his world, a place from which there was no return. She refused. "I don't want your protection," she said, her voice barely a whisper but laced with steel. "I don't want any part of your world." His expression hardened, a mask of cold control snapping back into place. "You're already in it," he replied, his voice flat and final. "You have been since that night. Your refusal doesn't change the reality." The chasm between them was laid bare, her fierce independence against his suffocating control, her moral clarity against his pragmatic darkness. The tension was a blade between them, sharp and gleaming in the low light of the restaurant. As they left, the argument hanging unresolved in the air, a car screeched to a halt beside them on the quiet street. Two men with hard faces and hostile eyes got out, their hands concealed inside their jackets. They weren't his. Ilara's blood ran cold as she recognized one of them, an associate of the same client whose illegal request had started it all. They ignored Falcone, their eyes locked on her with predatory intent. In that instant, his words echoed in her mind. "You're already in it." The threat was no longer an abstract concept. It was here, breathing down her neck, and the only thing standing between her and them was the very man she was trying so desperately to push away. Without a sound, Vincent Falcone moved. He didn't step in front of Ilara to shield her. He placed himself slightly to her side, a subtle shift in position that transformed him from a bystander into a participant. The motion was fluid, economical, and utterly menacing. The two men, who had approached with the swagger of predators, hesitated for a fraction of a second. They had expected him to cut his losses, to abandon the woman who was clearly a civilian liability. His quiet, deliberate insertion into the conflict was not in their calculations. It was a violation of the underworld's unspoken rules of engagement, a king stepping into the mud of a common street fight, and the air crackled with the gravity of his decision. The falling rain seemed to hiss as it struck the pavement around them, each drop a countdown to an explosion. The first man sneered, trying to reclaim his lost momentum. "This has nothing to do with you, Falcone. Our business is with her, a message from a former employer." He spoke the words with a forced confidence, but his eyes darted nervously, unable to hold Vincent's cold, unwavering gaze. The threat was now explicit, a direct link back to the world of corporate corruption she had tried to escape, a world that had now hired monsters from the shadows to enforce its will. For Ilara, the confirmation was a cold stone in her stomach. She was not a random victim. She was a target, hunted for an act of integrity that now seemed like a fatal miscalculation. She had expected to be fired, not to have a death sentence put on her for refusing to sign a lie. In that frozen moment, Ilara did something that defied every instinct for self-preservation she had ever possessed. She had spent her entire life making herself small, staying silent, and avoiding confrontation. But seeing the cold dismissal in the thug's eyes and the unreadable stillness in Falcone's, something within her broke. She took a half step forward, a small, defiant move that placed her almost shoulder to shoulder with the most feared man in the city. "Whatever message you have," she said, her voice trembling but clear, cutting through the damp night air, "you can deliver it to me. This doesn't concern him." It was a reckless, suicidal act of courage, an attempt to shield a man who needed no shielding, and in doing so, she broke the cardinal rule of her own world. She refused to be invisible. Her words hung in the air, a shocking testament to a spirit they had fundamentally misjudged. Vincent Falcone turned his head slightly, his dark eyes locking onto hers for a single searing second. He saw no fear. He saw the same raw, unyielding fire from the garage, now weaponized, not in self-defense, but in a bizarre, illogical defense of him. This woman, who should be cowering behind him, was instead standing beside him, drawing a line in the sand. In that instant, she ceased to be a complication or a responsibility. She became a reflection of an honor he thought had vanished from the world. The cold, pragmatic calculus of his empire dissolved, replaced by a single, primal, and utterly illogical imperative. He would not let them touch her.
He had broken his own code the moment he cut her ropes. Now he would shatter it completely. The ensuing violence was a blur of dark wool and brutal efficiency. It was not a fight, it was an execution. Falcone moved with a speed that seemed impossible for a man his size, a ghost of motion between the raindrops. There was no wasted energy, no theatrical flourish. One of the men reached inside his jacket, but his hand never emerged. A sickening crack echoed in the narrow street as Falcone's elbow struck his throat, and the man crumpled to the wet pavements without a sound. The second assailant, paralyzed by shock, only had time to widen his eyes before Falcone's hand shot out, grabbing him by the front of his coat and slamming his head into the brick wall of the adjacent building. The dull, wet thud was a full stop, a final, bloody period at the end of a short, violent sentence. It was over in less than 5 seconds. The street was suddenly, profoundly silent, the only sounds the soft patter of the rain and the distant, indifferent hum of city traffic. The two men lay broken on the ground, one unmoving, the other groaning softly, a dark stain spreading on the bricks behind his head. Ilara stood frozen, her mind struggling to process the lethal grace she had just witnessed. This was not the brawling of street thugs. It was the work of a master, a man for whom violence was not an act of passion, but a tool, wielded with the same dispassionate precision as a surgeon's scalpel. The air was thick with the coppery sense of blood and the chilling reality of what he was capable of. The monster she had only glimpsed was now fully revealed. He turned to face her, his expression unreadable, his chest rising and falling in a slow, controlled rhythm. Not a single drop of blood had touched his suit. He was an island of perfect, deadly calm in the wreckage he had created. His eyes, however, were a different story. They were dark pools of chaos, a storm of self-recrimination, and a terrifying possessive darkness. He had just exposed himself for her, performing an act of street-level violence unworthy of a Don, an act that would have witnesses and consequences. He had broken the most important rule of all. He had allowed an outsider to see the machinery of his world, and in doing so, had made himself vulnerable in a way he had not been in decades. The cold, pragmatic calculus of his empire dissolved, replaced by a single, primal, and utterly illogical imperative. He would not let them touch her. He had broken his own code the moment he cut her ropes. Now he would shatter it completely. The ensuing violence was a blur of dark wool and brutal efficiency. It was not a fight, it was an execution. Falcone moved with a speed that seemed impossible for a man his size, a ghost of motion between the raindrops. There was no wasted energy, no theatrical flourish. One of the men reached inside his jacket, but his hand never emerged. A sickening crack echoed in the narrow street as Falcone's elbow struck his throat, and the man crumpled to the wet pavement without a sound. The second assailant, paralyzed by shock, only had time to widen his eyes before Falcone's hand shot out, grabbing him by the front of his coat and slamming his head into the brick wall of the adjacent building. The dull, wet thud was a full stop, a final, bloody period at the end of a short, violent sentence. It was over in less than 5 seconds. The street was suddenly, profoundly silent, the only sounds the soft patter of the rain and the distant, indifferent hum of city traffic. The two men lay broken on the ground, one unmoving, the other groaning softly, a dark stain spreading on the bricks behind his head. Ilara stood frozen, her mind struggling to process the lethal grace she had just witnessed. This was not the brawling of street thugs. It was the work of a master, a man for whom violence was not an act of passion, but a tool, wielded with the same dispassionate precision as a surgeon's scalpel. The air was thick with the coppery sense of blood and the chilling reality of what he was capable of. The monster she had only glimpsed was now fully revealed. He turned to face her, his expression unreadable, his chest rising and falling in a slow, controlled rhythm. Not a single drop of blood had touched his suit. He was an island of perfect, deadly calm in the wreckage he had created. His eyes, however, were a different story. They were dark pools of chaos, a storm of self-recrimination, and a terrifying, possessive darkness. He had just exposed himself for her, performing an act of street-level violence unworthy of a Don, an act that would have witnesses and consequences. He had broken the most important rule of all. He had allowed an outsider to see the machinery of his world, and in doing so, had made himself vulnerable in a way he had not been in decades. He reached out, his hand moving slowly as if to give her time of her retreat. She didn't. His fingers, surprisingly warm, brushed against her cheek, his thumb gently tracing the line of her jaw. The touch was not one of passion or desire. It was a desperate, grounding act, an anchor in the storm he had unleashed.
It was a question and a confession, a silent apology for the world he had dragged her into, and a raw, unspoken claim. In that single point of contact, she felt the tremor in his hand, the barest hint of the immense control it took for him to remain standing, to not pull her into an embrace that would shatter them both. The gesture was more intimate than a kiss, a moment of profound, terrifying connection forged in blood and rain. In his eyes, she saw it all, the guilt of a lifetime, the profound loneliness of a man who could command armies but could not touch another human being without causing pain. She saw the truth. He had not saved her because he was a good man, but because in her he had seen a flicker of the goodness he had long ago murdered in himself. And for him, looking down at her, seeing not revulsion, but a deep, sorrowful understanding, he realized the true extent of his transgression. He had not just killed two men. He had torn a hole in the fabric of his own solitude, allowing a light to pour in that would either save him or burn him to ashes. He was no longer just a king on his throne. He was a man, terrified and exposed. He let his hand fall, and the space between them became a chasm of unspoken truths. The sirens began to wail in the distance, a mournful cry that signaled the end of one life and the impossible beginning of another. He did not need to say a word. She did not need to ask. They both knew, standing in the rain-slicked street amidst the wreckage of his control and her innocence, that nothing could ever be the same. The line had not just been crossed, it had been erased, and they were now bound together on the other side of it, two solitary figures caught in the silent, devastating aftermath of a broken code. If you were moved by this moment of impossible connection, show your support by liking and sharing the story, and let us know in the comments what you think will happen next. The distant wail of sirens was the closing bell on their shared moment of violent intimacy. Before Ilara could fully process the scene, Falcone's hand was on her arm, his touch firm and impersonal, guiding her away from the carnage. He moved with a chilling purpose, half pulling her toward the main street, where the city lights bled into the rain. He flagged down a yellow cab with an authority that stopped it instantly. He pushed a wad of bills into the driver's hand, opened the back door for her, and gave a single, clipped command: "Get her home, safely." He didn't look at her as he closed the door, his face a mask of stone. Through the rain-streaked window, she watched him turn and melt back into the shadows, a ghost reclaiming his darkness, leaving her utterly alone with the echo of what he had done for her. Back in her apartment, the silence was a physical entity, heavier and more oppressive than ever before. It was no longer the quiet of solitude, but the deafening roar of absence. She stood dripping on the hardwood floor, the city lights outside her window blurred into a watercolor of lonely, distant stars. The ticking of the clock on her wall, once a comforting rhythm, now sounded like a slow, merciless countdown. Every creak of the building, every distant siren, was a potential threat. The safety of her small world had been a fragile illusion, shattered by the brutal efficiency she had witnessed. He had protected her by unleashing the very monster she feared, and the knowledge of that paradox settled deep in her bones, a cold, permanent weight that she would carry forever.
For Vincent Falcone, the consequences were immediate and severe. The incident was a breach of protocol, a messy public display that violated every principle of discretion upon which his empire was built. It was a sign of weakness, of emotion, of vulnerability that his rivals would probe and exploit. In the sterile silence of his penthouse office, overlooking the glittering, indifferent city, he faced a different kind of war. It was a quiet battle fought in hushed phone calls and veiled threats, a necessary reassertion of his authority. He had to become colder, more ruthless, to erase the memory of the man who had engaged in a street brawl for a woman. He had to bury the part of himself that she had resurrected, knowing that its very existence now endangered them both. The unspoken decision was made in the cold light of the following day. He severed all contact. The quiet surveillance ceased, the chance encounters ended. The city, which for a few surreal weeks had felt like a stage for their tense, magnetic dance, reverted to being a vast, anonymous landscape. For Ilara, his sudden, total withdrawal was a different kind of violence, a silent, brutal amputation. She found herself scanning every crowd, her heart lurching at the sight of every dark suit or black sedan, searching for a ghost she both feared and desperately missed. The void he left was a tangible thing, a hollow space in the fabric of her days that ached with the weight of unspoken words and the memory of a touch in the rain. Days bled into weeks, and the sharp edges of her fear began to soften, replaced by a strange, melancholy clarity. The pain of his absence was a crucible, burning away the last of her naivety. She was no longer the timid woman who moved through the world hoping to be unseen. She had stood beside a killer and had not flinched. She had witnessed the darkest parts of human nature and had survived.
Looking out her window now, she saw the city not as a force of oppression, but as a complex, wounded entity, much like the man who ruled its shadows. Her trauma had not broken her. It had forged her into something stronger, someone who understood that moral lines were not drawn in ink, but etched in the fragile, complicated landscape of the human heart. She began to rebuild, piece by piece. She found a new job at a small, independent architectural firm, a place where her integrity was valued, not seen as a liability. She started sketching again, not just buildings, but faces, trying to capture the complex storm of guilt and loneliness she had seen in his eyes. Yet his presence was a phantom limb, an ache that reminded her of what was missing. The world felt muted, the colors less vibrant, without the dangerous, dark contrast he had provided. She was safe, she was free, but she was haunted by the knowledge that a part of her would forever remain in that rain-slicked alley, bound to the man who had shown her the terrifying beauty of a soul at war with itself. In his own world, Vincent was a king entombed in his castle. He was surrounded by the trappings of power, loyal soldiers, limitless wealth, the fear and respect of his peers, but he had never felt more isolated. The memory of her was a persistent, low-grade fever, a warmth that threatened the cold control that had kept him alive for so long. He would find himself staring at his own hands, remembering the feel of her skin, the impossible act of cutting her free. He had spent a lifetime building walls around his heart, and with one defiant look, she had found the one loose stone. Now, in the dead of night, he felt the draft, a chilling reminder of the profound, gaping hole she had left in his carefully constructed solitude. He could not allow himself to see her, but he could not abandon her to the world's indifference. One afternoon, a plain white envelope arrived for her at her new office. It had no return address. Inside was a cashier's check for an amount so large it made her feel dizzy, enough to solve all her family's financial problems and secure her future for years to come. There was no note, no explanation, just the cold, impersonal numbers on the paper. It was his way of closing the ledger, a transactional act of protection that was both a profound gift and a devastating insult. It was a gilded cage offered from a distance, a final attempt to control her life, to ensure her safety in the only way he knew how, with money, the bloodless tool of his empire. Ilara stared at the check for a long time, the paper feeling heavy and unclean in her hands.
A year ago, she would have seen it as a miracle, a lifeline. Now, she saw it for what it was, a chain. To accept it would be to accept a permanent connection to his world, to become a kept woman, a secret dependent on the profits of violence and fear. It would be a betrayal of the very integrity he had claimed to admire in her. With a steady hand, she took a black pen and wrote a single word across the face of the check: void. She sealed it in a new envelope and mailed it to the only address she knew for him, the exclusive restaurant where he had laid the truth of their two worlds bare. The returned check landed on his mahogany desk like a judgment. He stared at the single, defiant word she had written, and for the first time in years, a slow, sad smile touched Vincent Falcone's lips. She had refused his gilded cage. She had chosen her own path, her own strength, her own poverty over his protection. It was the most courageous, most foolish, most beautiful thing he had ever seen. The silence that followed was absolute. He had retreated to his darkness, and she had chosen her light. They were two solitary figures in the same city, separated by an unbridgeable moral chasm, forever bound by the silent, echoing truth of what had passed between them in the rain. 2 years passed, each day a quiet act of deliberate construction. Elara was no longer a ghost in the hallways of other people's ambitions. She was the lead architect on her first major public project, a community library in a neglected part of the city. It was a building of her own design, a structure born not from ego, but from empathy. The lines were clean, honest, the materials humble, but strong. It was filled with walls of glass that invited the light in, a direct and defiant answer to the world of shadows she had once been dragged into. On the day of the dedication ceremony, she stood before her creation, the autumn sun warming her face, a woman who had learned to draw new blueprints for a life she once thought was irrevocably erased. The building was more than just steel and concrete. It was a testament to her survival, a quiet monument to the strength she had found in the wreckage. She was surrounded by the sounds of celebration, a polite applause of city officials, the excited chatter of children who would soon fill the halls, the proud, tearful voice of her mother. Colleagues shook her hand, praising her vision and her talent. She smiled, accepted the congratulations, her heart filled with a genuine, quiet pride. Yet, even amidst the noise and the triumph, a strange, profound silence resonated within her. There was an absence, a single, critical observer whose judgment she craved more than any other.
She had built this structure of light and hope, but its foundations were laid in a dark, rain-slicked alley, and only one other person in the world could ever truly understand the cost of its creation. Her success felt beautifully, achingly incomplete. Her gaze drifted from the smiling faces, scanning the small crowd gathered in the plaza in front of the library. It was an old habit, a lingering echo of the days when she constantly searched for a shadow, a threat, or a guardian. And then she saw him. He was standing at the far edge of the plaza, partially obscured by a stone column, a figure carved from memory and tailored wool. Vincent Falcone. He was older, the silver at his temples more pronounced, the lines around his eyes deeper. He was utterly still, a dark, solitary island in a sea of celebration. He was not there as a don or as a threat. He was simply a man, watching from a distance, his solitude a palpable force that seemed to bend the very light around him. He was a king in exile from a world she had built. For a long, breathless moment, their eyes met across the expanse. The noise of the crowd, the city traffic, the entire world seemed to fade away, leaving only the silent, charged connection between them. There was no fear in her gaze now, only a deep, quiet understanding. In his, she saw none of the cold control or the predatory stillness she remembered. Instead, she saw a profound, unguarded pride, a sorrowful acceptance of his own eternal distance, and something that looked devastatingly like peace. It was a silent conversation that spoke of everything left unsaid: his regret, her forgiveness, his acknowledgement of her strength, and her gratitude for the brutal, life-altering gift of his protection. In that shared look, two worlds touched for the last time, not in violence or fear, but in a moment of pure, unadorned humanity. He gave her a single solemn nod. It was not a greeting. It was an absolution and a farewell. It was the closing of a ledger that had nothing to do with money. It was his final act of letting her go, of acknowledging that the light she had created was a world he could witness but never enter. Then, just as he always had, he turned and was gone, absorbed back into the city's anonymous pulse, leaving nothing behind but the indelible imprint of his presence on her soul. Ilara felt a single tear trace a path down her cheek, but it was not a tear of sadness. It was a release, the final, quiet settling of a debt that had bound them together across an impossible divide. The ghost that had haunted her was finally at rest. She turned back to her building, placing a hand against the cool, solid stone of its foundation. It was real. She was real. She was safe. She finally understood that redemption was not about erasing the darkness, but about what you chose to build in its wake. Some saviors live in the shadows, and some cages are the only things that ever truly set you free. If this story of a bond forged in darkness has left its mark on you, help us build our community of story lovers. Like, share, and subscribe for more tales that dare to find light in the most unexpected of places. And tell us in the comments what you believe that final, silent look truly meant.